My grandma was watching the news, and that's how we actually found out about it. They didn't even ask for the money, they just shot him. It destroyed his chest. He was already dead when the police got there. And then to find out it was kids 15 years old, I was just so mad.
It was a horrific crime, but you look at Salo, Salo's different than any other defendant I've ever represented. An injustice was done. Salo should never have been sentenced as an adult and should never have been sentenced to mandatory life in prison.
167, United States.
The American criminal justice system enforces our laws and keeps watch over us.
Is that person in the courtroom now?
But who is watching the system? I'm Joe Berlinger, and I've used my camera for 20 years to knock down doors and pursue the truth.
Our faith in the system.
Now we're going inside the American criminal justice system.
Any comments on the charges?
From law enforcement to elected officials, the court system to corrections, to find out if justice is being served. We're here in Michigan. We are looking at a very important issue in the criminal justice system, namely, should juvenile offenders who commit adult crimes like murder be charged as adults or be treated as juveniles? In 29 states, including Michigan, the mandatory sentence for murder is life without the possibility of parole, even for juveniles, even as young as 13. There are more than 2,000 juveniles serving mandatory life sentences in the United States, and over 360 are in Michigan. That's the most per capita of any state. But in 2012, in the case of Miller versus Alabama, the U.S. Supreme Court banned mandatory life without parole sentences for all juveniles, even those who commit murder. Now, judges would have to hold a separate sentencing hearing, taking into account a list of mitigating factors before sending juvenile murderers away for the rest of their lives. In this episode of The System, we'll examine the cases of two juveniles serving life without parole in Michigan, one sentenced years before the Miller decision and one sentenced immediately after. 34-year-old Salo Montalvo has spent more than half his life in prison for his role in the robbery and murder of a convenience store clerk when he was 16. I've come to Grand Rapids to meet Salo's defense attorney, Larry Phelan. What do you want people to know about this case? It's not a typical case.
No, it's not typical. And number one, it involved juveniles, which is tragic in and of itself that someone that young could be involved in a murder. From Salo's perspective, you look at him and you meet him and you talk to him. Within minutes, you know Salo's different. Salo's different than any other defendant I've ever represented.
In 1996, 16-year-old Salo drove his two friends, Chris Peltier and Robert Mays, to the West Side Beer Cooler, a convenience store in West Grand Rapids. Salo waited outside in the stolen getaway car while the other two boys entered the store. Peltier stole the cash register while Mays shot and killed the store clerk, 61-year-old Rodney Corp. A neighbor across the street witnessed the robbery, and the following day, all three boys were arrested and charged with the murder.
Call from a prisoner at the Michigan Department of Corrections.
Hey, it's Joe Berlinger. We haven't met yet, but how are you doing?
I'm good. It's nice to meet you.
Same here. If you don't mind just telling me about the crime itself, you know, how that all unfolded and what your thoughts were.
Initially, Chris and Robert wanted me to shoot the clerk, and I refused to do that. But I agreed to drive the car instead, and Robert volunteered to murder the clerk. In my mind, I rationalized that, well, if I'm in the car, then that means I'm not there, and so I'm not really a part of it. It was probably around 11:30 by the time we actually arrived at the beer cooler. I remember just feeling anxious, really anxious the whole time, and just wanting this night to be over with. Chris got out of the car, he went into the store, and moments later, Robert followed, and I sat there, and it seemed like time just slowed down. I can't count the minutes. I remember hearing two loud clapping noises. which then I knew was the gun being fired. And then all of a sudden, Chris and Robert rushed back to the car, and then I sped off. The next afternoon, we were arrested at the mall. They took us each in different cars to the juvenile center. We were all separated, and so they put me in a cell by myself, and I broke down. It was terrifying, just replaying everything over and over and over again, and realizing that what I did was horrible, that I was no different than Robert, who pulled the trigger. I think that's when it really sunk in, and I was mortified at the terrible thing I had done.
Yeah, it must have been a tough moment.
From the beginning, the moment I met Salo, there was a sadness and remorsefulness about his involvement that many criminal defendants do not have. Many criminal defendants in the system blame everybody but themselves. That wasn't Salo at all. Salo, from the moment he was questioned, he admitted his responsibility, didn't deny it, didn't try to sugarcoat it, and that's what I respected about Salo.
Despite the remorse that Salo felt, despite the fact that he wasn't the person who shot and killed Rodney Corp, and despite his age of 16, under Michigan law, Salo received the mandatory adult sentence of life without the possibility of parole.
Because he was the getaway driver, because he helped in the commission of this felony murder in Michigan, he's just as guilty and suffers the same consequence as Robert Mays, the shooter in the case. That's the law.
For decades, many states have viewed life sentences to be a just punishment for juveniles who participate in murder, but that is starting to change. Deborah LaBelle is an Ann Arbor-based attorney leading the fight to reform juvenile sentencing laws in Michigan.
This is one of the most deeply flawed parts of our judicial and legal system, what to do with children. We have turned away from the juvenile court system and the concept of rehabilitation of children for no good reason. There's been a series of decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court starting to understand how children must be treated and punished differently than adults.
We'll hear argument first this morning in Case 10-9646, Miller versus Alabama. Mr. Stevenson.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court.
In 2012, in the case of Miller versus Alabama, the court said that mandatory life without parole sentences for children is simply wrong. And they said it would be the rare child, if at all, that would ever be sentenced to life without parole because we can't predict at the front end that a child can't be redeemed.
Just weeks after the Supreme Court's decision in Miller, Michigan had its first chance to interpret the new law, and that's our second story. The case revolves around Jawan Wickware. Jawan was only 16 when he and some friends robbed and shot to death a pizza delivery man in Flint, a city which consistently ranks as one of the most dangerous in the country. David Layton is the district attorney who prosecuted Jawan Wickware.
When I first got elected, I never anticipated that I would have perhaps the most difficult district attorney job in America. We've had record homicide rates, and per capita, we're annually in the top 3 of the most violent cities in America.
This was one of the most heinous cases I've seen since I've been working here. This was total, senseless killing.
David Gwynn was the prosecutor on call the night that the pizza delivery man, Michael Nettles, was murdered. He prosecuted the case against Jawan Wickware.
David, we always felt that this was premeditated. We always looked at the evidence and felt that this was a setup. Is that right?
Correct. During that 30 minutes, waiting for the pizza to be delivered, they sat there and plotted and schemed and planned on what they were going to do. They were pretty much lying in wait when Mr. Nettles arrived. He was pretty much led to the slaughter. They told him to give up the money and give up the pizza. And Mr. Nettles didn't put up any resistance. He handed them the entire bag and walked away, where he was shot in the back from the porch, going back to his vehicle, and from his vehicle pulling out of the drive. He was shot at least 8 times. His cousin was in the vehicle with him. She was just going on a ride along to get to the store to get something for one of her children.
911.
My daughter's in Liverpool.
Okay, I need you to calm down. Where are you at?
I don't even know.
Okay, what's the problem, ma'am?
He shot. He was walking, and they shot him in his back, and he ran into a pole and something else, and he right there on the corner. Sonny is still alive. I just took off running because I'm pregnant, and there was nothing else to do.
Numerous spent shell casings in the driveway. There was blood all over the car. Mr. Nettles expired right there at the scene. Horrific, horrific crimes. He was unarmed. He was working for $3 an hour, plus tips. He was married with 4 children. And they shot him for no reason.
Prosecutors charged the teens with first-degree murder and sought the maximum adult sentence. However, under the recent Supreme Court's Miller ruling, the judge now had a choice. Life without parole was no longer mandatory. In fact, the Supreme Court said life without parole for juveniles should be, quote, uncommon. But despite the new law, Jawan Wickware still received the maximum penalty of life without the possibility of parole.
He did an adult crime, he's got to face an adult sentence.
I've come to Flint to meet Jody Hemingway, Jawan's attorney, to find out more about what happened the night Michael Nettles was murdered in Flint's most dangerous neighborhood, Merrill Hood.
This is the area where Jawan grew up. You can see there's a lot of abandoned housing, bars on the windows, dilapidation, decay. I wouldn't be here after dark. It's not safe. Jawan had to be here every day of his life. He didn't have a choice. This is the house where, when the call was made to the pizza delivery place, the delivery vehicle would have pulled into the driveway here, and Mr. Nettles probably came up to the porch. This area.
Michael Nettles arrived after dark to an empty house. The teens approached him from the backyard so they could ambush him. Several of the boys, including Jawan, carried guns.
Mr. Nettles gave the pizza and you know, just backed away, and he did what he would, you know, what they asked, and the other co-defendants just shot him 8 times at that point. I don't think Jawan knew that was going to happen. I don't.
At trial, there was conflicting testimony about who fired the shots that killed Michael Nettles. What was not disputed was the fact that Jawan carried and fired a .22 caliber rifle, and that the fatal shots were not fired from his gun.
All of the shells that were recovered from the vehicle and from the body were consistent with a .40 caliber weapon, which can't be confused with a .22.
Even though there was sufficient evidence to prove that Jawan's bullets didn't kill Mr. Nettles, he was the only one of the teens that later confessed to his involvement in the crime. The rest of his co-conspirators either pled down to lesser charges or were acquitted due to a lack of evidence. Jawan was the only teen convicted of first-degree felony murder.
Hi, Jawan. It's Jody Hemingway. How you doing?
Hey, it's Joe Berlinger. How are you?
I'm doing good.
How old are you actually now?
19.
And how long have you been in there?
I've been incarcerated altogether, going on 4 years in April.
Wow. When did you start hanging out with your friends who you ended up doing that crime with?
I've been knowing them since I was like 10. I kind of looked up to them because I had no father in my life. And, you know, I ain't had nobody, so I just tried to fit in, which was a good idea.
Do you ever think about the victim, Michael Nettles?
Yeah, you know, I keep him in my prayers. Try to pray for him and his family.
If you could talk to his family, what would you tell them?
I'll tell him, you know, I'm sorry for what happened, you know. I just, you know, basically send out my deepest sympathy to his family. It really ain't too much to say, you know, because I know sorry can't even bring his life back, so I wish it could have went a different way. I wish it would have never happened.
When I met with Jawan, I saw a young man who had very immature, short-sighted insight on his involvement with this crime.
Dr. Karen Noel Clark is the psychologist who evaluated Jawan and testified at his sentencing hearing.
Jawan and many adolescent criminals tend to have very little appreciation for long-term consequences. They are much more driven by immediate gratification than the ultimate costs to their lives, to the lives of their families, to the lives of the victims. They are very, very caught up in the moment.
The U.S. Supreme Court's Miller ruling focused heavily on the developmental differences between adolescents and adults, citing recent advances in neuroscience that suggest adolescent brains are not yet fully developed when it comes to impulse control, planning ahead, and risk avoidance.
Adolescents are young and malleable and should not be denied the rest of their lives for actions that are taken at that period of their lives.
Perhaps he wasn't fully developed in his brain, as some of the experts may say. However, I just don't understand anybody who could be so insensitive to the life of another human being. To me, that is such a heinous and grievous offense that you have to go away for a very long time.
18 years ago, Salo Montalvo was sentenced to life without parole for his role in the murder of 61-year-old Rodney Corp, a convenience store clerk in West Grand Rapids. Salo's advocates say that he has matured from who he was at 16. Now 34, he has turned his life around in prison, studying to be an ordained minister and even marrying his childhood sweetheart, Laura. Laura has stood by his side since the day he was arrested and hopes that the Supreme Court's Miller ruling can someday lead to a chance of parole for her husband. To better understand Salo's troubled past, I've come to his old school to meet Laura and one of his former teachers, Janae Dean.
All right, so these are yearbook photos from when we were in middle school together. That's his 7th grade picture.
And you knew him back then?
Yeah, we went to school together from 1st grade through 8th grade. I watched him as a little boy, just, you know, being fun and energetic and full of life, and I just kind of watched him change from a happy person to someone who is more angry and distant and cold.
What do you want people to know about Salo?
I know that just knowing him most of my life, that the core of him is very sensitive and gentle and kind. You know, it is hard. What do you tell somebody that, yeah, he's in there, what he did, and we're fully honest about his guilt and his participation. And I think that, again, shows the core of his heart, that he's willing to be that honest.
How do you feel about having taught him and seeing the path he went down? Is it shocking to you that he went down this road?
Well, one of the things that I've learned is that a lot of the students go through a period where they are really trying to find out who they are and what they believe. I know Salo wanted to please. He wanted to be accepted, and because of some of the difficulties at home, I think he really longed to be loved. I remember he was telling me the story about his parents divorcing. It really affected Salo. There's a hill behind our school, and he went up to that hill, and he said he just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And when he was done crying, he felt this anger developing, and he came down the hill. Instead of being a little boy who was broken, he decided to be a tough kid that was mad and angry.
The fact that he did this,
right.
How does that weigh upon you, you know?
Sometimes it's really heavy. He helped take somebody's life, and therefore, he owes a debt to society. And we try really hard to be very considerate towards the victim's family members, because these crimes are very serious and some of them are extremely heinous. I would hate that if somebody did that to my family member or myself.
Our family was furious with these kids. I mean, absolutely enraged. They didn't even ask for the money, they just shot them.
Stephanie Mitchell was only 14 when her great-uncle, Rodney Corp, was murdered.
My Uncle Rod was very caring. He would do anything for anybody. I just often remember him laughing a lot. When he entered a room, you knew it, and everyone enjoyed having him around. My grandma was watching the news, and she's seen it, and she knew it was him because of his loafers. And they brought him out on the stretcher, and all you could see was his loafers of his shoes. That's how our family found out about it. During the trial, 2 of these boys, they were just so heartless about it. They would turn back and just laugh at our family. I mean, are you kidding me? I feel anybody's family would want to see justice be served. And we did.
At the time of sentencing, Judge Dennis Kalenda had 2 choices: sentence Salo as a juvenile, which meant release from prison in 5 years at age 21, or sentence him as an adult, which at the time meant mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole. Salo's lawyer, Larry Phelan, pleaded with the court to give Salo the juvenile sentence, but Judge Kalenda chose the adult life sentence. Today, the 2 men have agreed to meet me at a local diner to discuss the case for the first time in 15 years.
Was Montalvo the only juvenile that you've put away for life?
No. I must admit, I don't remember how many, and fortunately, it wasn't a lot.
And you guys, I guess, had a little bit of a different view on whether or not he should have been sentenced as a juvenile. Can you guys talk about that issue?
Well, I thought the just sentence was the juvenile sentence. The judge had a differing opinion, and I still think to this day it was the wrong decision.
I won't say that I disagreed with Larry as to what the just sentence was. The question is, what was the legally required sentence? I still think that for that crime, 5 years was not enough.
You had a choice, and you didn't like the choice. And so you took the choice that, in my opinion, was the easy way out. For a judge, it's the easy way out.
How do you feel about that?
Believe me, there was nothing easy about it.
I do think it's a valid point that 5 years is a little light for murdering.
That sentence would never have stood. Our Court of Appeals and Supreme Court would have changed it, and we'd be right here, and you'd be asking me exactly the same questions.
How do you know how the Court of Appeals is going to say, or the Supreme Court's going to say? You know as well as I, the appellate courts give great deference to the trial court.
Not on that issue.
Under your theory, then no juvenile would ever win. I can't think of any scenario then of any juvenile under that system at that time that would ever win.
That proves the flaw in the law.
Well,
and in that regard, you're right.
What do you think would have been an appropriate sentence?
If the options were life with parole or life without parole, I'm fairly confident that I would have said a parolable life. I don't like the idea at sentencing that we predict forever what somebody's going to be like.
For decades, judges like Dennis Kalenda have grappled with Michigan's mandatory life without parole sentencing laws for juveniles convicted of murder. In 2012, in the case of Miller versus Alabama, the U.S. Supreme Court banned mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles. But the court did not specify whether the new law should be applied retroactively to cases like Salo's. That question was left to the states. Michigan now finds itself in a heated political battle over what to do with the 363 juveniles already serving mandatory life sentences in its prisons.
We're here in Michigan. We are looking at a very important issue in the criminal justice system, namely, should juvenile offenders who commit adult crimes like murder be charged as adults or be treated as juveniles?
In 29 states, including Michigan, the mandatory sentence for murder is life without the possibility of parole, even for juveniles, even as young as 13. In 2012, in the case of Miller versus Alabama, the U.S. Supreme Court banned mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles. But the court did not specify whether the new law should be applied retroactively. That question was left to the states. Michigan now finds itself in a heated political battle over what to do with the 363 juveniles already serving mandatory life sentences in its prisons.
I believe the Supreme Court made the right decision, recognizing that you shouldn't have a blanket policy across the board when you're talking about juveniles. If it was cruel and unusual to have a blanket policy on juvenile life sentences, why doesn't that pertain to everyone who was sentenced prior to Miller versus Alabama?
Republican Representative Joe Haveman has sponsored a set of bills that would mandate new hearings for all juveniles who received mandatory life sentences prior to the Supreme Court's Miller ruling.
Retroactivity was important to me. Not freedom, not a commuted sentence, not anything that would say that they're definitely coming out. But in the spirit of Miller, at least have recognition that these 363 people in prison deserve a second look.
Good morning. The Committee on Criminal Justice will come to order.
In August of 2013, the Michigan State Legislature held a hearing on the issue of retroactivity. Many victims' family members came out to voice their opposition to the proposed legislation.
This guy was killed by a 16-and-a-half-year-old teen who took his gun, put it to the side of his head, pulled the trigger.
They want to bring their loved ones home. We can't.
Future cases, I think I can somewhat understand. Going back, releasing these people that have already been sentenced and having us to relive that, I just can't understand.
For my family, it has been 23 years. 23 years of being constantly reminded or living the nightmare of what happened to my brother.
Not all of the victims' families opposed the idea of giving a second chance to these juvenile lifers. Stephanie Mitchell, grandniece of Rodney Corp, spoke in support of retroactivity.
My deepest condolences to all the families out here. There are some that these people don't need to be released, but there are some that do. In certain circumstances, the prisoner does deserve a second chance.
In 2008, Salo wrote to Rodney Corp's family asking for their forgiveness. He received no reply, but 3 years later, after a local newspaper published a feature story about his life, an answer finally came.
Hi, my name is Stephanie. I'm Rodney Corp's great niece. After the Grand Rapids Press published your article, there was something you said that touched me. If I had to make a choice, I would choose forgiveness from the victim's family over getting out of prison. That is why I would like to start this letter by saying, we forgive you.
After writing to Salo in prison, Stephanie connected with Salo's wife, Laura, and his teacher, Janae Dean. 6 months ago, Stephanie visited Salo in prison for the first time.
I remember being, nervous. This is the family of the man whose life I took, and so how to face them, it was huge,
I asked him some pretty hard questions, I think, for him to answer. Probably one of the hardest things for me to hear was, did he see my uncle before that day? And he did. He bought a pack of gum from him earlier that day. And he could have told me, no, I never seen your uncle.
I remember I was so afraid that she would hate me after this, and her family would hate me. And it was such a blessing and a relief to me. She still forgave me, for murdering her uncle.
I feel like prison has helped Salo in so many ways. He grew and he changed a lot, but I think part of that growth and change was the fact that he was seeing a future of possibly never coming home. I definitely think a middle ground sentence would be sufficient for him, but I don't think a juvenile sentence would have been enough for who he was at that time.
Was there a turning point in prison where it all started to make sense and you decided you were going to turn your life around?
The change to who I am today definitely wasn't like an instantaneous thing, but it was definitely a process. The 18 years I've spent here, they haven't by no means been an enjoyable 18 years, but it's been totally necessary to bring me to the point where I am today.
Salo is the real thing. He is a role model in that prison. He is truly what we want our corrections department to produce. He's an example of why the system needs to be changed. He's an example of why Miller versus Alabama happened.
The Michigan State Legislature eventually passed a bill ending mandatory life sentences for juveniles, but did not vote on retroactivity, leaving that issue unresolved until the Michigan Supreme Court makes the ultimate decision.
I'm disappointed. We were right back to the old stereotype of we need to punish people, and that punishment is an eye for an eye.
Flint, Michigan consistently ranks as one of the most dangerous cities in America. It is here that 33-year-old pizza delivery man Michael Nettles was robbed and shot to death by a group of teenagers. During the ensuing trials, there was conflicting testimony as to which one of the juvenile offenders actually shot and killed Mr. Nettles as he tried to escape. But only one of the defendants, Jawan Wickware, was ever found guilty of felony murder. For the past 4 years, 19-year-old Wickware has sat in prison, sentenced there for the rest of his natural life.
What was it like, growing up in Flint?
A lot of guns and drugs. As I was growing up, seeing other people doing this, I used to think like that's how I had to survive to get money. But they were selling drugs and stuff. So I just felt like, oh yeah, that's easy. That's easy money. So I can get it this way.
Did you ever feel scared or threatened?
Yeah. I thought I was being shot a lot of times, because a lot of people didn't like it. So I didn't know who to trust sometimes. I gotta watch where I go.
Yeah. Tell me about your mom.
My mom, she really ain't got that much, She got a job, but the check ain't really that much.
24 phone numbers.
She out there doing it by herself. Take care of me and my 4 sisters. She kind of a good mom.
Sonia Burks has been working her job at the laundromat for almost 9 years. Despite recent health problems, including a broken arm, she never misses a day.
Can't afford to take no time off. Every dollar counts. So, come to work with a broken arm and everything, all in pain too.
These days, her biggest concern is making enough money to support Jawan in prison.
Right now, he needs a care packet, so we're trying to get the money together right now to send it to. It's like $80. It's expensive, but it's worth it. So that way he have his own food, own personal needs, stuff like that. So we want to ask nobody for nothing.
Sonia has stood by Jawan's side from the time he was arrested 4 years ago for his participation in the murder of Michael Nettles. Jawan was only 16 at the time, and the police could not question him without her consent.
I was kind of scared. I was high. I was high off weed and pills. It was 2 officers, and they interviewed me, interrogated me. I really didn't know what to do.
At his interrogation, Jawan admitted his part in the crime and implicated the other teens. This confession all but guaranteed a conviction. And at trial, a jury found Jawan guilty on 4 counts, including felony murder, which carries a sentence of life in prison. But because of the U.S. Supreme Court's Miller decision, handed down just weeks before the trial, life without parole was no longer automatic. A parolable sentence was now possible. Jawan had a right to a sentencing hearing to weigh all of the factors at play in his case. It was the first Miller hearing ever held in Michigan.
Miller versus Alabama threw everybody in the prosecution world for a loop. I realized we were going to have to prove to the judge that this young man deserves a sentence of life without parole.
All right, we're on the record in the people of the state of Michigan versus Jawan Antoine Wickware, case number 1, 2.
The judge, Archie Heyman, would have to hear testimony from both sides regarding Jawan's culpability and his potential for rehabilitation. The prosecuting attorney, David Gwynn, was adamant that Jawan was a murderer and a threat to society and sought the maximum sentence of life without parole. Jawan's attorney, Jody Hemingway, argued that Jawan was not the actual shooter who killed Mr. Nettles, and his traumatic upbringing matched the mitigating circumstances laid out by the Supreme Court. Therefore, she argued, he deserved a parolable sentence.
My role was to develop a picture of who he was, who he had been, how certain external things impacted who he had become. His mom seems to have tried very hard to keep her family together, but there was a 2-year span that she did not work because she'd been laid off. And then I think she was homeless.
Beginning in 1st grade, Jawan attended 7 different schools in 8 years, missing an average of 56 school days a year.
His school history was fraught with failure. He was virtually illiterate. He always felt rejected by school, and he got in a lot of fights.
In 8th grade, Jawan was suspended for 120 days for hitting a school security guard.
After he was suspended from school, it sounds as though he did virtually nothing at home, that was structured or productive, and he spent his time in the street. He started using marijuana and ecstasy and other drugs. And if you don't have positive role models, then that's a pretty huge hurdle for you to transcend.
The prosecution made its case by bringing up a serious offense from Jawan's criminal past.
All right, at this time, the people propose exhibit number 3 admitted, which is a copy of Flint Police Department complaint number 07-40774 regarding the carjacking incident. He had criminal activity back to age 11. This was not something that he did, once or twice. This is his everyday routine.
Now, yes, he had a tough upbringing, but he still had to have known right from wrong. He had to have known that you don't aim a gun at the back of an innocent man who's done nothing to you and pull the trigger.
Homicides are all terrible, but Jawan, he's not the person who killed Michael Nettles. To lock him up and throw away the key for his role is disproportionate to what he did, and it's not constitutional.
After 2 days of testimony, Judge Heyman delivered his decision.
Mr. Wickware, in my opinion, is capable of rehabilitation because of his youth and also because the reports seem to indicate that he has made some progress. I would tend to believe that that factor weighs in favor of Mr. Wickware. But having said that, I think the circumstances of this offense are egregious. He was in the thick of it, he assisted, and therefore he's just as responsible for the killing as the shooter is. He has shown very aggressive, violent behavior. That factor weighs against Mr. Wickware. I think his family life has been chaotic, it's been unstable. I think it has put him in a position where he probably would be a threat to society. That factor also weighs against Mr. Wickware. So it is the decision of this court that on the count 1, which is the felony murder, to sentence him to life without the possibility of parole. And I do that with a very heavy heart. It took a lot of thought to come to this conclusion, but after reviewing everything and all the testimony, I am convinced that it is the right thing to do in this particular situation.
The whole thing was turned on its head, and Jawan's mitigating factors were used as a way to say, all of these obstacles to his rehabilitation exist, so he probably can't be rehabilitated. And it's the opposite.
I don't see how the judge could say that Jawan was too far gone. I think that at 16, that's a little too early to write him off for life.
Michael Joseph Nettles doesn't get a second chance. His 4 children don't get a second chance to have a father.
All those arguments against life without parole, while I understand them, they don't move me towards saying that this man or somebody in a like position should get a lesser sentence.
Jawan is the 364th juvenile sentenced to life without the possibility of parole in Michigan, a number that continues to grow despite the Miller ruling.
Miller says, who among us can decide what child at the front end is irredeemable? You cannot tell what's going to happen. So then to have him serve the rest of his life in prison is a deeply flawed interpretation of Miller, and also really impugn the integrity of our judicial system.
In March of 2014, the sentence of life without parole for juveniles was challenged in the Michigan Supreme Court. The court was asked to determine if it is ever constitutional to lock up a child for the rest of his life for felony murder.
We have to redouble teaching judges, I think, that are used to just sending these kids off, that it's a new day. And hopefully the Michigan Supreme Court will say, you can't do this.
In March of 2014, the debate over juvenile sentencing finally reached Michigan's highest court. 3 cases heard here will determine how Michigan moves forward when sentencing juvenile murderers.
Hear ye, hear ye. The Honorable Chief Justice and Justices of the Supreme Court of the State of Michigan. All persons having business with this honorable court are admonished to draw nigh and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the United States, the State of Michigan, and this honorable court.
One of the cases being argued raises the question, should life without parole ever be an appropriate sentence for juveniles convicted of felony murder? Exactly the crime both Salo Montalvo and Jawan Wickware are in prison for.
The development of the Eighth Amendment has suggested that where you have circumstances where the court has found no intent to kill, felony murder, aiding and abetting, there needs to be a protection from these most extreme sentences.
The law punishes consequences.
It always has. I just don't see how you can categorically say that all felony murders are less blameworthy than a premeditated murder and not get life without parole in that situation.
Another case will answer the question left unresolved by the U.S. Supreme Court. Should the Miller ruling be applied retroactively? In other words, should the 363 juveniles already serving life without parole be given a new sentencing hearing and a second chance at freedom?
I believe that the court in Miller chose its words very carefully. What Miller did was make a mandatory life without parole sentence unconstitutional, not a life without parole.
There's no one currently sitting in the Department of Corrections in the state of Michigan on a punishment that the law cannot impose. That's a key.
Miller made it clear that the lack of individualized sentencing has led to widespread mismatches between culpability and therefore inaccurate sentences, basically. So we've got 363 juvenile lifers right now sentenced under the old scheme who are serving inaccurate sentences at this point.
If the option of sentencing these young people to life without parole was taken away, it would be a very bad situation. Even if you can suggest that somebody might be rehabilitated, you still have to, first and foremost, keep in mind the victims and the family of the victims. Any sentence less than life without parole could potentially re-traumatize them.
Hopefully our Michigan Supreme Court will do the right thing and recognize that we need to take vengeance out of the punishment of our children, and we need to focus on rehabilitation. Surely we can rehabilitate and bring them back into society.
Where me and Salo are gonna live together when he comes home someday.
Laura Montalvo has spent the last 3 years creating a home for her and her husband, Salo. Should the Michigan Supreme Court vote yes on retroactivity, Salo might finally get a parole hearing and a chance to come home.
Pardon the mess, this is his office. This is the room where he got to choose his own colors. He chose this really bold red and this really bold blue, and the ceiling is a bold purple, which I tried to talk him out of, and he was like, I really, really want it purple, so I said, okay, this is your room. I will let go of every ounce of control I want to have.
Laura has known Salo for most of his life, from his happy childhood through his troubled adolescence to the reformed man he has become. Even though 18 years ago he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, she has stood by him faithfully. 4 years ago, they were married in a ceremony held in prison.
This is just a fraction of all the letters that we have, and it's such a building of our relationship, starting from, you know, when we were 15 and 16. There's a lot of history, you know? A lot of history here. Oh, this one's from our wedding day.
The thing that I'm most afraid of missing is to have, you know, a family and children with Laura, to give her parents and my parents grandchildren, you know. I think that is definitely my biggest fear in terms of not being able to come home and spending the rest of my life here.
How we treat those who break our laws, how we treat those in prison is really a reflection of how we are as a society. And what does it say about us that we're willing to let people die in a prison cell without looking at them? Is it possible that there's a child so damaged that they will never be able to come out? I don't know. No one can predict. But we should have the concept that there's redemption and rehabilitation, and we should structure a system that tries to get them there as soon as possible.
You were involved in something that resulted in a death. The group thought about it in advance. It wasn't an accident. In a fair and just world, what do you think would have been an appropriate sentence?
You know, I feel, you know, I didn't kill him. You know, I didn't do the crime. You know, I deserved, you know, a couple years, but not this punishment that I got. I was young, you know, they didn't show me no kind of lenience. But, you know, I messed up, you know, I feel I deserve another chance to go back out there, you know, and do right.
I think the system works. I think the system worked in this case. I think Mr. Wickware should and is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Where things need to be fixed is before we ever get to the situation where Wickware has a gun in his hand. We need to do a whole lot better job of educating our children, of educating people not to have children if they're not in a position to raise them appropriately. Those are societal issues that we're really not addressing. That's where the system's broken. The criminal justice system works just fine.
There are people out there who say, well, boy, he did something terrible, you know, why should he get a break? Can you explain why people should think about giving people a break who have life without parole sentences as juveniles?
You know, I feel that I would love to be free, but at the same time, realizing the weight of what I've done, my stance is one of asking for mercy and asking through that mercy for a second chance. If the Michigan Supreme Court does not rule the Miller case to be retroactive, I would have just some disappointment, because I would love to be able to have that second chance. I've grown so much, and I do feel that I'm ready to be free again. But at the same time, I definitely have peace with how God is using me here and the opportunities and to serve others here. I would just continue to try to make a difference. If I spend the rest of my life here, then that's what my life will be.